All right, guys, so I want to do a couple things in this video. So one is to show you the difference between server components and client components and when to use which. And then I also want to show you some of the hooks that we get from the Next.js navigation or from the Next router. So we can do things like redirect from our functions. We can get the ID from the URL. We can get query params, things that you're going to do throughout this project. All right, so the stuff we're going to do right now isn't going to stay. It's just to kind of teach you some of the features, but we will be using it later on. Now, one thing I want to show you before that is if you're getting weird warnings and errors in your console, it's most likely from a browser extension. So I had a couple actually, one from ColorZilla, I had one from LastPass, Grammarly is also a culprit with this. But if I enable ColorZilla and I reload, I get this extra attributes from server warning. So if you're seeing anything like this, it's most likely a browser extension because ColorZilla is inserting HTML into the client that doesn't match what's coming from the server, so it's giving us a warning. So you can either ignore it or you can just disable whatever's giving you a problem. So if I disable ColorZilla, you can see that now that's gone. All right, so I just wanted to mention that so you don't freak out and think you did something wrong. All right, now as far as server versus client, this page is pretty helpful, this little chart here, this table. So it says, what do you need to do? Server component, client component. Now, server components are the default, right? So the one I want to work with right now is properties, brackets ID, and then the page.jsx inside that. That's this, property / and then whatever you have for an ID. So this is running on the server or rendered server side by default. Any component that we create is until we label it as client, which I'll show you how to do in a minute. Now there's only so much you can do from a server component. It's basically, it just renders on the server. Anything after that, if you have any event listeners and you make it interactive, then it needs to be a client component. Now you can fetch data. I'm going to show you how to do that, how to fetch data from a server component. Of course, you can fetch data from a client component, but you would do it in like a use effect hook if it was on page load or through an event listener or something like that. But you can fetch data from the server and you can load it with the page, right? Now you can also access backend resources directly through a server component. Like let's say we're using an ORM like Mongoose. So you could actually use Mongoose in a React component if it's a server component. Sensitive information like API keys, tokens, things like that, you can safely put those in a server component and users won't be able to see that from the client. All right. Keep large dependencies on the server so you can reduce client-side JavaScript. So those are pretty much the reasons you would use a server component. The way that I do it is if I don't need it to be interactive, if I don't need events and hooks, then keep it a server component. Now, this stuff here, if you want to add interactivity, if you want to add on-click, on-change, any events like that, has to be a client component. If you want to use state and lifecycle effects, then you need to use a client component. In fact, you can't use any React hooks in a server component. Use browser-only APIs. Obviously, you can't access things like geolocation and local storage. You can't access from the server. That has to be a client component. And then any custom hooks that depend on any of those things, also client. And then React class components also need to be client. Now I just want to show you what happens. Actually, before I do that, let's just do a quick console log here in the server component. And you'll notice that that hello logs down here in the terminal, not in the browser. If I reload this page, this is this component, but we don't see that hello because this is rendering on the server, so we're going to see it down here. So you need to know where to look. If you're working in a server component, look down here for your console. If it's client, then you look over here. Now, if I were to bring in, I want to bring in a hook called useRouter. And this is going to be from, on older versions of Next, it would be next/router, but on newer versions, 13 and 14, it's going to be next/navigation. And then we would initialize that router, let's say router, set that to use router, and get rid of that console log. As soon as I save that, I'm going to see an error. It says use router only works in client components. Add the use client directive at the top of the file. And it doesn't matter if it was use router or use state, use effect, any hook, use anything is going to give me an error if it's a server component. So in that case, I actually have to add at the top here in quotes, use client. It can be double or single quotes. As soon as I do that, now my page works again. And if I put that console log back there, so if we say console log hello, now you'll see that it's actually logging down here in the client console. All right, now as far as the router goes, is just to quickly show you some of the things we can do. We could have like a button, let's say BG blue 500 and padding 2, and we'll just say go home. Okay, so that gives us this button, and then since this is a client component, I can add an on click just like I could in any regular React client side component, and we'll just have a function, and we'll take that router and let's call push, which will let us redirect to, let's say, slash. All right, so now if I click that button, it brings me to the home page. All right, so anytime you want to add an on click, an on change, use any hooks, anything like that, it's going to have to be a client component. Now, while we're working with this next navigation stuff, let's look at some of the other hooks that are available. So we are going to need to get this ID at some point. If you're on the client, you can get that with use params. So we can come down here, we can say const, we could do params equals use params, and then we could use params.id, or we can destructure this and we can just get the ID, and then let's see, I don't know, we'll put that in the button here. So ID, and now you can see in the button we have 1, 2, 3. If I were to put something else in here like 200, we see 200. So we're able to get that ID. Now there might be cases where you have a query param, like let's say name equals John. Now to get this, you don't use params, you use search params. So this is different from earlier versions of Next. So use search params, and then we can come down here, let's say const search params, initialize that to use search params, and let's say we want to get that name, so const name. We can now get that with search params, and then there's a method on that object called get, and we can pass in the name that we want, which is name in this case. So now I'm going to come down here, I'll change that ID out to name, and you see John. If I change that to Brad, we see Brad. Okay, and then the last one I want to show you from Next Navigation is use path name. So down here, let's say const path name equals use path name, and then I'll just go ahead and add that into the button, and you see property /200. If I do property /100, it's going to change. Okay, so these are just some of the helpful hooks that you can use from Next Navigation from the router. Now, we're not going to use any of this stuff in our main project, so I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to get rid of everything, but I am going to keep it as a client component. But the button, we can get rid of that. We'll just say property page again. All right, so now we're back to where we started. I just wanted to kind of go over those things. Now we're going to start to work on the actual UI. So in the next video, we're going to start on the navbar, which ultimately is going to be a pretty hefty component, especially when we get to authentication. We're going to show the number of messages in the navbar. We're going to conditionally show links. So in the next video, we're just going to scratch the surface by creating the navbar.